I think we gotta start here. I got the Crowley sunglasses, feeling kind of cool. I'm your host, not for possession or Deville, and welcome to hell. This is my little YouTube channel where I make new Good Omens content every week. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. If you're a returning subscriber, if you're a returning subscriber, welcome as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate having you here as well. I've been thinking about this video a lot. So this week's video is specifically about the topic of Crowley's fall as a trauma narrative, right? And I have so many thoughts about this because there's a couple different ways you can take this. Number one, when it comes to the actual narrative of the story itself, there's a lot we don't know. The fall, Crowley's fall from heaven is sort of this nebulous thing, which is kind of vaguely hinted at in both the book and the show. It's never really investigated that closely, right? It's something that we know happened, but it's sort of played as like a casual thing, at least in the book. It's said that he sauntered vaguely downwards more than, fell. But we do see in the show a little bit more in depth in that. And I think there's a lot of pain for him in the show. If you watch the show itself, you can see there's a lot of pain there. You can see there's a lot of anguish there. He still prays, as it were, throughout the first season. And so it's sort of something that clearly he takes a lot more personally than it's something he takes personally in the book, I think, which is an interesting choice, but makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of changes between like the book and the show. I think the book stays a little bit closer to what we understand with biblical canon versus what we understand with like the show's canon, which I think takes a little bit of a switch. I don't think it's a bad thing, of course, but I think it's a little bit different. But I do find that in the show, at least, it seems like something he does take harder. And if you think about in the episode in which Aziraphale is discorporated in season 1, right? He gets drunk and he starts talking about how he never meant to fall, he asked questions, he hung out with the wrong people. There's all these little things that hint to what happened, but they still don't tell the full story. They don't tell the full narrative. And I have to wonder, with how they've built up how season 2 began, which was before the beginning of the world, I have to wonder if season 3 might include an opener that shows Crowley's fall. And I feel like there's a couple reasons why I think they could or should do that. I think one of those reasons is because the way season 2 kind of ended that scene in the first episode where Crowley asks, what's the worst that could happen by asking questions, it kind of leaves itself open to that. But I also think there's a very good chance that since the second coming is going to be, the theme of season 3, that there might be another kind of war in heaven or a war between heaven and hell. And I feel like it would be an interesting callback to what happened the first time around and kind of give us a little bit more of an idea. Throughout the first season, again, like I said, there's hints from Crowley himself. There's also a little bit of a hint from Gabriel, who, when he's talking about, the first war, whatever, he says Crowley and the rest were cast out or thrown out, but nothing was ever really resolved. So it's very clear that there is more to this story, and I would be very interested to know, like, what else are we not seeing? And I do think it's worth delving into this idea of like the trauma narrative from the perspective of, everything in this show is, I think, definitely metaphors. Like I've said before in a previous video, I think the relationship between Crowley and Aziraphale itself is a really interesting metaphor. It's a queer metaphor. It's a metaphor, for religious trauma, especially in the case of Aziraphale, but even with Crowley, there's a lot of religious trauma there. And I think there is something to be said about that metaphorical, idea. And so when you think about the fall specifically, what kind of metaphor does that call to mind? Well, to me, it calls to mind the idea of a child who is kicked out of their home for, one reason or another by a parent, let's say. In this case, God is, the mother figure, the mother of all creation. She created the angels, even the ones who rebelled. And for someone like Crowley, she specifically, and the other demons, she specifically created them knowing that they were going to fall, knowing that they were going to, in his case, ask questions or rebel or whatever it is. And so it begs the question of, at that point, it's not just trauma. It's not just the trauma of you are kicking out your child for doing, something wrong or not following what you believe. You're now kicking them out for doing something that you always knew they were going to do. And that's the entire reason they were put there. And I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had about that, especially, with the narrative about Adam and him becoming kind of more human and not doing what he was put on the earth to do, as Gabriel says in season 1, that, he was put on the earth for one reason, and that was to end it, but he doesn't do that. He forges his own path. But we really see that Crowley and the other demons don't have that option. They don't have the option to forge their own path. Their path was kind of already set. And I know a lot of times when we talk about religious themes like this, for me, I'm talking as someone who's a former Catholic, but when we talk about that, we always talk about free will, and we as humans have this free will to make decisions, to do right or do wrong, to follow what the Bible says or what this religion says versus that religion. And I think the idea of free will is very interesting, but it comes with some caveats, especially when you consider the kind of Christian teaching that God is omniscient. Now, it's hard to say whether or not this seems to be true in the Good Omens universe. I would argue that she is, in the sense that she is the narrator of season 1. So I would argue that as the narrator, she, can see everything, knows everything, and she probably knows it in advance. So therefore, what we have, again, is a situation where she created all of these angels, knowing full well that 33% of them, at least according to what I recall was the original number who rebelled, were going to rebel. We're going to ask questions. We're going to challenge her rule, as it were. And we're therefore going to fall because of it. And so it begs the question, if you know in advance that someone is going to do something, can you really consider that free will? Is it really free will if you know already with 100% certainty this is what's going to happen? And not many people can say they know things with 100% certainty. There's not really a way to guarantee something like that. But presumably if you are an all-knowing, all-seeing God, you certainly have the ability to know things with 100% certainty when it comes to whether or not something is going to happen or whether or not someone is going to do something, especially if you created them for that purpose. And so it becomes this trauma narrative of first of all, the demons did not know what was going to be awaiting them. Presumably, hell did not exist before. Everything was created within 6 days, the entire universe, the earth, all of that. So that suggests to me that until the fall happened, hell did not exist. And therefore, what you have is people who are doing something, they have no clue what the consequences are. And so it's a lot different than someone who maybe, you break a law, you go to jail. You know what the consequences are, at least to some degree. Obviously, I don't think that's a one-to-one narrative or metaphor, I should say. But for the most part, you know what the consequence of that is going to be, right? For the most part, I think we can all kind of agree, unless you're wealthy, in which case there are no consequences, but that's not the point. But if there was never a rule that said, hey, if you do something wrong, there's going to be a consequence. How would you know? If you have to think, before all this happened, there was no hell. Therefore, there was no known repercussion for. And again, too, I think it's worth noting that, again, this narrative is not one-to-one, because asking a question is not the same. And there's a whole other, philosophical argument one can make about all of these things. That's, not the point of this. What I'm saying is, like, it's not a one-to-one metaphor. So let's get that right out of the way. But what I'm saying is, too, is like, this was not something that was known, right? No one knew what the consequence was going to be. So I think for the rebelling angels, it was kind of like, what's going to happen? And Crowley even says that. What is the worst that can happen? Asking questions, because hell did not exist before that. And I think it's very, very interesting and very, very telling, because you see that he doesn't see there's anything wrong with what he's doing. And I think it's kind of, and it adds to this sort of like childlike quality to it, and adds to that sort of traumatic narrative of like a child being kicked out of their home, because he has this childlike desire to ask questions and to know information. And he's so excited about this universe that he helped create. And he wants to know, like, why does it have to end? You built this thing, why would you end it so quickly, or ever even? You know what I mean? And so it's very, very interesting that this is the narrative here, right? And especially, like I said, you have the mother of all creation. Even if you go by the father of all creation, it really doesn't make it better. And as someone who's had plenty of father trauma myself, it just kind of adds to it, really. You have this narrative of this character who has this very childlike desire to ask questions, this very childlike need to wonder and learn and try and figure out why things are the way they are. Why is this rule this rule? Why is it that you can't ask questions? And since the only real authority is God, or at least that's the presumed only real authority. I mean, I guess you could say the other angels are clearly their own authority amongst themselves, and that's its own thing. But like, as far as they're concerned, the only people who can actually kick you out, again, presumably, unless season 3 explains something else, the only one who can kick you out specifically is going to be God, which is this mother figure. So when you take all of those things into consideration, when you also take into consideration, like I said earlier, the specific queer narrative that we have here, and you combine those two things, you have the ultimate sort of metaphor of something that's still happening to this day. And that is, one of the number one reasons young people are kicked out of their home for being queer. And it's such a devastating thing to think about it. And it's something that I really take so deeply personally as a queer person, because it's so like wrong. It's like you bring this child into the world and then, oh, sorry, you're not what I expected, so you have to go. And in the case of this character here, it's very much that same thing. It's like, okay, you are challenging what you're supposed to be doing, let's say. You're challenging what I expect you to be doing, which is not asking questions, which is just following what I've said, which is something that definitely is some religious trauma right there. Blindly following and not asking questions is a pretty common expectation in a lot of Christian doctrine, I will say. So it kind of follows in that respect. And then if you don't do that, you are now going to be thrown out. And where do you go? What becomes of you after that? And I think in the case of this show, we know what becomes of them. They are sent to hell. They are sent to as far flung away from God and God's light as it's, the way people talk about it, the void, the pit, boiling sulfur. It's also corrupting you and who you are and their features. Their wings turn black. And if they ever had any halo, that is certainly gone. Crowley's eyes turn more snake-like. A lot of them become sort of animals and animal creatures. You see a lot of things when you see the demons in hell, whenever they are shown in the show. You see a lot of things that lead to some interesting questions about how this came to be. At what point during the fall was this part of the punishment? It's not just enough that, you're kicked out of your home. It's now adding insult to injury. It's now making it so much worse, because they're, being thrown specifically into burning sulfur. It's now so much more. And again, for what? For what is the crime here? It's really, really dark when you think about it. And this is, this isn't just in the show. This is one of the oldest stories in the Bible. It's one of the oldest stories about, this sort of good versus evil. But what is the evil in asking questions? What is the evil in doing essentially what you were put there for, what you were expected to do? Very, very hard to discuss this narrative without going down the path of it's an inherently traumatic one and it's an inherently upsetting one. And I think it's interesting too, because you see throughout the show, and especially this becomes really prevalent in season 2, is there's a lot of instances where Crowley very subtly will kind of look upwards when something is going particularly bad for him, as like a sort of, as if it wasn't bad enough that he was kicked out of his home, as if it wasn't bad enough that he was made into a demon. Now there is all this other stuff on top of it. And I think it's very, very interesting, because it's like, it's the constant needling. It's the constant, like, it's not just one punishment. It becomes the constant unending punishments. And again, the question becomes, for what? What was the purpose of that? Why is this the thing? And, my mother made a very astute assessment that I had not considered until she mentioned this. And this will be in a later video in the next coming weeks when we talk about the first episode of the first season of Good Omens that we're going to review together. She made the interesting assessment that if you look at the difference between heaven and hell specifically, heaven is obviously very clean cut and their suits are very nice and they all look very polished and wealthy, one would argue. And so there is kind of a very big class disparity that comes up between heaven and hell as well. They're supposed to be part of the same office building, is kind of how Neil has talked about it. But hell is clearly the basement. They are clearly in the part of the office building that is constantly leaking, constantly falling apart. But you also look at their clothing and you find that that's also very shabby and ripped and coming apart at the seams a lot of times. And so it begs the question, clearly there is a whole other side to this where it's like, again, it's not just the indignity of being kicked out, it's also, you're kicked out into the gutter and you are now at your lowest point and you were expected to be you were considered the epitome of all evil in that case. And I think it's very interesting, and I think it adds to that trauma narrative. And in Crowley's case, he's very much crawled out of that gutter, as it were, and made something for himself. And I think that's something that many of us ascribe to, and I think that's why many people are so drawn to his character, because you feel that traumatic story, you feel that traumatic narrative, and you feel for his character, and you want to see him happy, you want to see something good happening to him. And that's definitely what I'm hoping for season 3. I'd like to see good things for Crowley's character, because I do think he deserves that. And I think what we see time and again is, and the book really made a good point about talking about this, and I mentioned this in my last review of the book. There is this idea that the demons are inherently evil and bad, and the idea that angels are inherently good. But when you look at it in terms of the book, and I think when you look at it in terms of, stories in general, that's not necessarily the case. Crowley, I think, is proof that not all of them are bad. Obviously there are special exceptions. Hastur and Ligger are considered those special exceptions in the book specifically, and I think we see that throughout. But I think even something like Beelzebub is proof that you can change and you can evolve. And I think Gabriel is proof that you can evolve from being an asshole. I mean, I guess that remains to be seen. I still think he is one. I'm not gonna lie about that. I am still not impressed with him. I would argue that his actions very clearly facilitated the ending of season 2 that we got. I would argue that his fucking off to wherever, we still don't know, very much kind of ruined everything for Crowley and Aziraphale. So yeah, I have a hard time kind of feeling particularly fond for him. And again, that's its own thing. It's proof that you can evolve. You can be more than just what you start out as. And I think that's a very important narrative that comes up a lot in this show. So one thing I did want to say, and I kind of forgot this in my earlier notes, so I guess this is a good time to bring it up as any. I think it's worth noting, right, that as much as the fall is something that happened to Crowley and clearly was traumatic for him, it also remains sort of this sort of Damocles situation that's hanging over Aziraphale's head as well. Because for him, he knows that his friendship and his relationship with Crowley could potentially mean his losing everything. And it's interesting because we don't actually see any other angels fall after that sort of first major cataclysmic event. So it begs the question, is that something other angels have fallen, or is that not the case? Because realistically, that is not even the threat to Gabriel when he refuses to do his job. The threat to him specifically is to have his mind erased and be kind of lose his job and become someone else and kind of become a little worker bee. So the threat is not at all for him to become a demon and go to hell, which is kind of what he was expecting and I think clearly hoping for, if, you know, now that we know what we know. But it's interesting because that raises the question, what happens now? You know, obviously at the time, that was what happened. 33% of the angels fell and became demons. Now it seems like that's not the threat. Now it seems like the threat of stepping out of line is either being completely erased from existence, which is something that came up in season 2, but never really saw anything done with it. So I feel like there's a good chance that's going to come up again in season 3. I kind of feel like it has to come up again, right? Because it was this whole big threat throughout the second season, but nothing ever really came of it. Nothing was ever done with it. So I feel like it's like kind of the Chekhov's gun situation now. It's like, you've mentioned this, so it has to come up later, right? I don't know if I want it to necessarily, but I do feel like it almost has to come up later. It seems to me that at least as far as Aziraphale is concerned, he doesn't know what would happen to him if he's found out. I mean, he does in the sense that they already experienced it once, and it was pretty severe. Also, I will say it's interesting that the punishment that was originally going to be for Crowley and Aziraphale for stopping Armageddon was total annihilation through hellfire and holy water, and yet when Gabriel does it, that's not even on the table. They're just like, we're just gonna fire you from your job and make you do something else, but you're not gonna remember, so we good? We good. Like, why was that not the discussion for Aziraphale and Crowley? I guess it really doesn't matter. It was more interesting the way they did it, obviously, but it's just kind of interesting that heaven seems to change its decision making and how it does things and how it wants to punish different angels based on different things. And you'd think being more senior, as Gabriel was, that they would have done worse. I also have to wonder, why does it seem like the angels have kind of gone rogue and they're calling all the shots, but we don't ever see what God thinks about how things are going in this show. It's kind of really all up to the angels themselves. It seems to be like the Metatron, Seracriel, Michael, and Uriel kind of making all these executive decisions, formerly Gabriel, making all these executive decisions. Everything else is just kind of nebulous. Like, who is really in control here? Who's calling the shots here? And again, I think that's something we're going to find out more in season 3. And I'm kind of getting a little off topic, but I do think it's a trauma that has kind of scarred them both and is part of the reason for why they are the way they are. Because for Aziraphale, like I said, it's that religious trauma. It's that trauma of like indoctrination and it being expected to be something. And for him, it's kind of all he's ever known. For Crowley, and you know, kind of the opposite direction, he is clinging to this idea of his badness and demonicness because it's all he has. And if he's not that, then what was the point of anything that happened to him? What was the point of all that trauma? And I think that is something that's so relatable, unfortunately, every time I think about different things that have happened to me, different traumas, not even remotely similar to that, but just, just different traumas that happen throughout your life. And it's like, okay, well, if you didn't actually grow from it, if it wasn't for a purpose, the way everyone always wants to say, like, everything happens for a reason, if there wasn't a purpose to it, if you didn't grow from it, if nothing, like, what was the reason then? Why was that something that happened? And I think that's a very good and fair question. And I think for Crowley, that is something that there isn't really gonna be an answer to. If it's not a threat anymore for other angels, then why was it something he had to experience? If it's something that ultimately, everything that he did and everything that he went through, if it didn't mean anything in the end because God was just like, yeah, I don't care anymore, then what was the purpose of it? Why was this something that had to happen? Why was this something? Clearly, the demons had to be created for a reason, but again, it does beg the question, is there really free will if you were always meant to do this thing? If you were always created for this one specific purpose, is there really free will when you ultimately do that thing? And I think the show also handles that well in the question of, like, at the end of season 1, Crowley and Aziraphale ask the question, what if this was always the plan for Adam not to end the world? In which case, he did exactly what he was expected to do too. So if everything is kind of pre-planned and known, then what even is the nature of free will? And I think that's honestly its own video. Not going to be one I'm probably making anytime soon. I have other videos that I kind of have my interest more. I read a really amazing fanfic that was kind of talking about all of this. I cannot remember the name of it. One of my friends sent it to me. It's amazing. It's very, very popular in the fandom from what I've seen. It's got like 300,000 hits or something like that. And it's basically like Crowley going to therapy, and he eventually has to kind of reveal everything. And his therapist was previously an atheist. And so when she learns everything about, like, oh yeah, this is real, and she hears the story, she's like, no, that's actually fucked up. And, she's pissed, rightfully so, on Crowley's behalf. And I understand that. And I remember when I was reading it, and that I actually had planned this video before I read that story, and then when I read it, I was like, oh my God, this is like everything that I'm thinking and feeling. This is so amazing. There is no way to discuss something like The Fall, without discussing the kind of traumatic aspect of, like, here is this person who created you for all intents and purposes, your mother, or the closest you have to a mother, and you were cast out because you didn't live up to whatever the expectations were that you should be doing. And that is something that is very real, and that is something that happens to people. And so it's not just, an interesting metaphor. It's also just a real thing that happens, and it's so disturbing. Good triumphing over evil, isn't this great? It's like, I don't think this is making you look as good as you think it is, but that's... So next week's video, I'm kind of torn. I have a couple of different thoughts in my head for next week's video, because obviously next week is going to be actually Halloween, which is so wild to me that it's already going to be Halloween, and it happens to be on a Tuesday, so that's the day when my video is going to come out. So I have kind of two different plans. Originally, I was going to do reacting to the script book because I did just get that in. I got the Ultimate Edition. I'm very, very excited about it. I actually had a different idea that I wanted to do instead, which is going to be analyzing the kiss between Crowley and Aziraphale as, like, the ultimate act of desperation, which it was. And I think I want to do that more than I want to review the script book right now. I mean, obviously, I'm going to leave it to you. If you want to see the script book video more, then of course, let me know down in the comments below. Or if you'd prefer to see my analyzing the kiss video, let me know about that. Also, this is kind of like breaking news as I'm filming. It was revealed that the co-creator and co-showrunner, I guess, and executive producer Douglas McKinnon will not be returning for season 3. There's a good from what I've heard from, I think Deadline just posted a new article that season 3 they're hearing good things. Obviously season 2 did very well for Amazon, so it would make sense for them to renew it. But apparently Douglas has not signed on for the 3rd season. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to comment down below, like this video, subscribe to this channel. I really appreciate having you here. I have so much fun with all these videos, and I have so many more topics to talk about. Like I said, I have content well through the end of the year. You can also follow me on Patreon. That is going to be my members only channel, patreon.com/NarcissiDeville. I did recently qualify for doing the super chats and all those special emotes and things like that YouTube has now. I don't really know about a lot of that stuff, and I don't do a lot of live videos. I know YouTube really likes live videos. If you guys want to see that and you have like maybe questions that you'd want to ask me for a live video, let me know, and let me know like what you would want to see in a live video, and we can look into that. I've done it before. I had a lot of fun when I did live videos in the past, but it's kind of been a long time, so, and my channel is like so much bigger now than it was then, so we shall see. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time, stay devilish and see you next Tuesday.